Well, thank you very much for the interview. I'm Xiao from iChongqing. So actually in 2016, there are a series of projects and cooperation between Chongqing and Slovenia, particularly settled down here, involved electronics, logistic infrastructures, etc. Could you tell us more about what the progress on these projects and what's the current situation it's already been?
Yeah, well, I think one has to understand that the development of cooperation between China and Central Europe is growing these days. We belong to the part of Europe which doesn't have a long history of cooperation with China. So we are now catching up. You have probably heard about the initiative called 16+1. 16+1 means 16 Central East European countries plus China. Now recently Greece has joined, so it will be 17+1. And this is the framework within which we are developing new projects of cooperation. Some of these projects have gone quite far, and others are still at the early stage. So we have cooperation in industrial manufacturing mostly, but less so in the in logistics and infrastructure. And we look to the areas of electronics in particular as a future, and also in traffic infrastructure. Well, in essence, Belt and Road Initiative is very timely, and it is stronger than the anti-globalization tendencies which we also see. Obviously, in the previous history of globalization, in the immediate history, not everybody benefited. Many benefited from it, but some did not. So that created a debate, especially in Europe and in the United States. As a result, we see these anti-globalization pressures, but they are not strong. They will not be stronger than Belt and Road. I would like to give you one example. In March this year, President Xi went to Europe. He visited Italy and France and discussed, among other things, cooperation between European Union and China. And that visit was very important because Italy joined Belt and Road Initiative. Now, countries in Central and Eastern Europe have been cooperating within Belt and Road Initiative before, but the Western countries, Western Europe, which have a longer tradition of cooperation with China, did not have a big need so far. But this is changing. China is investing in ports now also in Italy, and through that with various traffic connections to the rest of Europe. It has started with Greece, as you know, with Piraeus some years ago, but now it is continuing with China's cooperation with Italy, with Spain. I hope also with Slovenia will have something in the coming years. So I think that this is an unstoppable progress. I would say Belt and Road Initiative is unstoppable now. Well, I have seen the white paper, not studied it yet, because it's very new and it's very substantial, I must say. And my first impression about the white paper which was issued today is that it is very strong rebuttal of American interpretation of trade talks, and the strong rebuttal of tariffs as an instrument in what is called the trade war. So I think that this was an expected reaction by China. It was an expected reaction by China, a strong opposition to the American effort to impose its domination in trade. Well, I would also like to say that the principle that China emphasized, the principles that China emphasized are very important for everybody in the world. Those principles are equal rights, equality, respect, sovereignty. These are important basic principles for economic cooperation. And I believe that it's important that China has said so. So I believe that this white paper is the beginning of a much needed and serious debate. And here I would like to say that the solution to all these problems can only be multilateral. It's not only about China and the United States, it's about everybody. Supply chains are today organized globally and everybody participates. And also, tariffs are considered to be inadequate for management of economic cooperation in 21st century. So tariffs are not adequate for managing trade relations and economic cooperation in the 21st century. Now, I would like to conclude this answer, and of course, if there are more questions, I'll be happy to discuss that. But to conclude this, I would like to remind you that when President Trump last year said, "Trade wars are smart and are easy to win." I don't know if you remember that quote. He said, "Trade wars are smart and are easy to win." That is what President Trump said. In Europe, the reaction was, in European Union, "No, trade wars are stupid and are easy to lose." It was President of European Council, Donald Tusk, who was saying that trade wars are stupid and are easy to lose. But the problem is that everybody is losing. The American customers, the European car makers, the Japanese car makers, everybody is losing in this trade war. So we have to get together and figure out a way forward. And I think that the Chinese white paper is quite useful in this context. Instead of everybody losing, we must have a system when everybody wins. Everybody should have some advantage. But this is still to be done. It's not going this way now. I hope it will change. Well, look, I would like to remind you that last year, in 2018, we have seen a very interesting development. There were very good talks between European Union and China. Very positive for the future. Also between China and Japan, there were good discussions between the European Union and Japan. And when the G20 met at the summit level in Buenos Aires, you remember 1st December last year, the leaders of G20 made an important decision. They did not speak about protectionism. They didn't want to enter a discussion on protectionism. They said we have to bring the whole debate into World Trade Organization, and we have to reform the World Trade Organization. In other words, a global approach, an approach based on openness and based on multilateral arrangements. The World Trade Organization has over decades abolished tariffs. Tariffs went very much down because of the global trade negotiations, global trade agreements. And that's the way forward. We have to discuss these things globally with a spirit of openness, reduction of tariffs, reduction of other barriers, and then we'll have progress for everybody. First, on cultures. You see, I come from Europe, and in Europe we emphasize individual freedom and competition. In Asia in general, and also in China in particular, there is a great emphasis on harmony and respect. So we have these two different approaches, but they can actually complement each other very well. And why I'm saying this, because we live in an era where we would have to combine competition and cooperation when it comes to trade, for example. There will be a lot of competition, but it has to be managed in a spirit of cooperation, not in spirit of animosity, but in spirit of cooperation. You see, one can compete in a way to improve one's own performance and make the best of oneself, and also to exact the best from the competitor. Not to see the competitor as an enemy that has to be destroyed, but as a partner which makes you better and which makes the competitor better. So I think that this basic idea of different cultures and the need to figure out the way forward is really fundamental nowadays. There are no forever friends and no forever enemies. We are not talking about this kind of enemy versus allies type of relationship. We talk about competition but also about cooperation. That's really very important to understand. And when it comes to the question of working for shared future, or it's a shared destiny, see, there is a difference in these two words in English. Destiny is not necessarily the best translation, because that means that it is there anyway. Destiny will happen, whatever we do. But it is not like this. Destiny will be good if we do the right things, and the destiny can be bad if we don't do the right things. So I suggest that we talk about shared future, and shared future is something that we develop together. Otherwise, it's not in our kind of purview to create future. We have to create the future together. Well, the interesting thing is that the world has the legal institutional framework already. It's not necessary to invent something very new. On trade, we can go to World Trade Organization and reform the organization so as to be able to help us building a better future. So we have, the world has plenty of experience, and none of the things are new. When we hear complaints about, for example, state subsidies, you are familiar with the discussion that China is subsidizing its economy and therefore has an advantage compared to other countries. Yeah, I will repeat. Well, very simply, the institutional framework internationally already exists. We don't have to build something totally new. We have the basic international institutional framework. So, for example, if one talks about state subsidies, there is a long history in the World Trade Organization of dealing with state subsidies. And it is not that only China uses state subsidies. Every country is using state subsidies. So, for example, if you think about the airplanes Boeing, the American airplanes Boeing, they are heavily subsidized by the American government. And there is a long discussion between Europe and the United States about state subsidies in the manufacturing of civil aircraft. So we have experience. There are certain areas of manufacturing industry where state subsidization is very widespread. And we have to figure out what is the right balance. What is the balance? How far should state subsidies go? And that has to be negotiated globally, multilaterally. Now, I could go on with state subsidies because much of technological development in the United States has been subsidized by state. It's not only startups and individual initiatives. A lot of state money involved. And that also has to be looked at. So, in short, as you know, multilateral framework exists. We have to use it intelligently to make sure that this common future will be a good future. Well, let me start with the second question. No, we have plenty of tourism, and many tourists from China are coming to Slovenia. It's a relatively new development, but a very visible one. So it happened to me that when I was once walking in the streets of the capital, I was stopped by a tourist guide with a group of Chinese tourists from Shanghai. And the tourist guide said, "This is our former president." So all the tourists wanted to have a picture with me. Now the Chinese tourists like to make pictures. The Chinese are very interested in using their smartphones and making pictures everywhere. And obviously they make a lot of pictures in Slovenia. If they meet me, then will make pictures with me as well. So it's good for tourism. Huh? They are very welcome guests. Now, on the Belt and Road, you see, Belt and Road is a major project. It's a really big global project of global development. So we have to understand that. And the key of that project is connectivity. I don't know how to translate this into Chinese, but in Europe, in English, the word connectivity is always there. So to give you an example of successful development in that regard, which doesn't relate directly to Slovenia, but our part of Europe more generally. Now, you know that port of Piraeus in Greece, which is the main port of the capital Athens, has been purchased by the Chinese company COSCO from Hong Kong. And that was some 4 or 5 years ago. Now, the thing is this: China can come as a strategic partner into a port city like Piraeus. And then it develops further investments in logistics further north into Europe, from Piraeus to Belgrade, to Budapest, and that makes connections better. So we see improvement of connectivity. This is an example of something that has already started happening. The development of Port of Piraeus has been very good. It has improved the Greek gross domestic product of Greece, provided new employment, helping the economy of Greece. But that's not the end, because the whole thing goes further into Europe. Now, obviously, these are all relatively new developments, and people are going to study them carefully, see what makes good sense. It has to be done in the spirit of win-win cooperation. There has to be advantage for both, for China and for European countries that are involved in that cooperation. Well, I think that the advantages are obvious, because we would need more and more cooperation, and the corridor is one of the important ways to do it. Now, this is not going to be all that simple, because at the same time there will be alternatives. For example, there will be the Arctic Sea corridor, which is now, which provides opportunities. With the global warming and melting of ice along the northern pole, Russia is investing a lot of money in ports along that northern corridor, which will shorten the sea travel from China to Western Europe through the northern part. And then there is a land corridor which goes through Central Asia, Russia, and then to Europe. And all this is going to be developed at the same time, so we have to figure out what is the right balance. Now, the future of the world is in more communication, more cooperation. But that requires really very careful management, because things are not simple. One has to make sure that the new forms, new ways of cooperating are also helping, for example, protection of environment, which is a very important consideration in Europe and in China. One has to make it in ways which would reduce the use of fossil fuels. That has to do with traffic also. How does one manage this so as to reduce fossil fuel consumption in the future? One aspect which doesn't look very central, but how are you going to use this? I mean, because the use of fuel for maritime transport can be harmful. We have seen this in years before. And the land communication, railways, can be less harmful, but slower. I mean, because the distances are large. So, I mean, I'm mentioning this to tell you that we do not consider this as an easy win. It's not easy to do it, but it is necessary, and it is for the benefit of everybody.
为了创造更好的未来，我们需要沟通与合作，同时也需要更好的去管理，因为没有什么事情是容易的。这种新的我们新的发展需要合作，比如我们现在在使用很多化石燃料，这有害于环境。成功的道路 都不是容易的，但是这是我们必须走的路。
There was a question in the back.
So
So we have to end?
Yeah, because of your schedule.
Yeah, sure. All right. Do we have one? Well, I think that Chongqing has an important role to play, but it has to be there. It has to be more in the focus. It has to be more pronounced, because you see, from European perspective, one thinks primarily about ports, the port cities like Shanghai, like Tianjin, like Hong Kong, and so forth, and technological center like Shenzhen. But then again, the vast manufacturing area of China is not always in the picture. So it's very important that the conferences on Belt and Road are taking place inland, not only either in Beijing or in the port cities. They have to take place inland. And obviously, Chongqing is a very important example of that. So I'm looking forward to this conference.